Welcome to Code and Concrete, the leading podcast for prop tech, conversations about the built environment, and other exciting innovations. If you learn something new, please consider following and leaving a positive review. Enjoy. Hi folks, this is going to be an extra special episode of Code and Concrete. Joining me is John Graham. John is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer, a lifelong adventurer, and co-leader of the Giraffe Heroes Project, which is a global movement that celebrates people who take courageous risks to solve real problems. After years working in wars and revolutions around the world, John shifted his focus to teaching moral courage through storytelling. He is the author of Quest, Risk, Adventure, and the Search for Meaning, and a sought-after speaker known for turning extraordinary experiences into practical lessons about courage, leadership, and purpose. John, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I can't wait to dive into how you got here today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Matthew. And if I'm on a podcast called Code and Concrete, I must be in the right place, right?
We're happy to have you, for sure. So, let's take it from the top. John, who are you? I mean, a U.S. Foreign Service officer, what was that about? And then how did that transpire into a life of adventure?
Yeah, well, the bumper sticker for my life is I'm lucky to be alive. I've had the first half of my life was nothing but one violent adventure after the other. And it didn't start with the Foreign Service. That was almost the culmination of it. I started early on. I went to sea on a freighter when I was just 17 years old. Those are the days, I was old as dirt, right? So those are the days when there were no container ships. It was just big boats run by 50 or 60 really tough guys. I got a job on one going to the Far East and back. And it was fabulous because I had grown up in Tacoma, Washington, which is a small city where nothing happens, in a family where nothing happened, and where I was expected to go to the University of Washington like my father and sister had done, and then marry the girl next door and come back and get a job and live out my life. And I was headed in that direction. And I got this crazy job on a freighter. And these guys, these 50 or 60 guys, took one look at me and they said, "Oh man, this kid, he's so green. He knows nothing. We're going to teach him life lessons that he's never going to get in Tacoma, Washington, or from going to college or whatever." And they didn't disappoint. I know this is a family station, so I'm not going to tell you all those life lessons, but let me tell you that was an incredibly open experience for me. And it was particularly important because up to that point in my life, I was really badly bullied. I was a scrawny little kid, and bigger kids picked on me. And I was looking desperately for some models of manhood. And I couldn't find him. I couldn't find him at home. I mean, I love my dad, sure, but he was a very gentle guy, constantly being pushed around by everybody around him, losing jobs and contracts and stuff because he couldn't defend himself. And so I said, "Oh man, I got to find a model for manhood." And I got to the ship heading to the Far East, and these 50, 60 guys. And boy, did I get models for manhood. I mean, the very first night, I'll tell you the story. It's very brief. I was out on deck that very first night, and one of the seamen approaches me, making sexual advances. And another guy, a huge black guy named Roy, he must have weighed 250, 260 pounds, grabs this first guy, slams him up against the bulkhead, beats the shit out of him, and cusses. Oh, a remarkable stream of cussing. I never heard cussing like that. And then throws him down on the deck. And I saw right away that was what a man did. That was manhood was all about. And that was the beginning of a whole early life based on physical adventure. I mean, adrenaline became my drug of choice, and that trip to the Far East was just the beginning. A year or two later, I was hitchhiking through the revolution in Algeria. I was hitchhiking in Europe after my freshman year in college, and I see in a newspaper that there's a war going on in Algeria. The rebels are trying to take the country back from the French. And so I said to myself, hey, that's an adventure I never been in, a real shooting war. So I hitchhiked down through Morocco and stepped across the border into Algeria. At least I'm smart enough to paste an American flag on my shirt so that the rebels won't shoot me as a Frenchman. But, I traveled in the middle of this war zone, and I became convinced that I was indestructible, that nothing would kill me, and the power of adrenaline as a drug became stronger and stronger. I mean, the next summer, I was with a group that made the first ascent of the most dangerous mountain wall, perhaps in all of North America, the Wickersham Wall, the north wall of Mount McKinley, Denali. We should have been killed, but we weren't. We walked away from it, first ascent. So there was mountain climbing, there was revolutions, and I was just looking for one more adventure after the other. Then the Foreign Service comes into my life. I mean, here I was mountain climbing. I was dodging bullets and bombs all over the place. I had just worked for a summer as a stringer for the Boston Globe, reporting on wars in Cyprus and Laos and Vietnam. And here the Foreign Service gives me a job. And I said, look, I don't want to be in an embassy in Europe. I want something more interesting than that. And they said, fine. So I began a Foreign Service career where I never did enter an embassy in Europe and wear striped pants or anything like that. I was in the middle of jungles and deserts, either starting or stopping wars or revolutions. And I absolutely loved it. Other people, my fellow officers were freaking out in the middle of physical violence, cars burning in a public square or rock throwing mobs, whatever. And I just loved it. I absolutely love that kind of adventure. And it just grew and grew. My personal heroes became people like John Wayne and, the other action heroes of the day. They were my heroes, and I thought that I'd found the meaning of my life through adventures. And by then, by the way, having road crew in college, I'd put on 35 pounds of muscle or so. So I was a formidable human being, 6.5 feet tall, tough, fearless, and that's where my life was headed. And then it turned around. I'll stop talking here, but it turned around. It turned around during a battle in Vietnam. Where I finally began to realize that a life based just on violent adventure was a shallow life, and I had to do better.
That is certainly a lot of risk-taking, is the first word that I would use to describe all of that. And for a lot of folks, they would be very fearful of those choices, those places. So I want to ask, what did you learn about fear throughout all of that maybe people misunderstand? Or how could they start to reprogram fear in their minds and then use that throughout their life?
Well, I discovered fairly early on that there were two kinds of fear. There was when you were in the middle of a violent adventure, for example, physical violent adventure. And at that, I was really good. I mean, you didn't want to mess with me. And I really was, quote unquote, fearless. And in terms of, dodging bullets or the other stuff I was doing. But then at the halfway point in my life, more or less, late 30s, I began to understand, mid 30s, that what scared me, where my fear came from, was not from physical adventure. It was from what I might call spiritual adventure, although I'm not particularly a religious person. It was a psychological adventure. It was emotional adventure, risk. I was terrified of taking emotional risks, of exposing my heart, of being open and honest with other people, all the things that make a complete human being, Matthew. I was scared to death. I would much rather face down a Viet Cong or a KGB agent than talk to someone where I might be feel socially inept. And so I began to realize that that the kind of courage that I needed, I didn't have. That kind of courage I needed to get, and I gradually found it. And I found it through re-examining the meaning for my life. and understanding that it didn't come from physical adventure. It came from, if I will, these emotional, psychological, spiritual adventures. And that came mostly from tackling tough public problems and taking risks to solve them. And that's what I began to do. It started really at the United Nations, where the State Department sent me after Vietnam. And I began to turn my life around and look at peace and justice issues in Africa and Asia, and noticing where my skills could really make a difference, and that I could be a peacemaker instead of a war maker. And my life proceeded from there. And it's about that time that I also met the wonderful woman who had started the Giraffe Heroes Project, which is all about heroes, all about courage. Um, and I thought at first it was kind of lightweight because, here was I, a big guy and, physical and all that. And here was this 5'2" woman who was telling stories of heroes, hoping to persuade people to use these examples of heroes to become heroic themselves. I thought at first it was lightweight, but then I fell madly in love with her. And Ann and I have been married and business partners in the Giraffe Heroes Project ever since. It's now been 44 years. We can talk more about the Giraffe Project. I'm sure we will. But that was the segue of where my life went. It was down into a pit that seemed bottomless and then crawling up the other side.
I'll have some questions about courage versus recklessness next, but I do want to learn about the Giraffe Heroes Project because it encourages courage in people. So how do you do that? Like, how do you inspire courage in folks?
We do it the same way that people have been doing it for 100,000 years. I mean, Neanderthals dancing around the campfire. Cultures have understood forever that if you want people to be heroic, you don't preach at them, because that never seems to work. What you do is provide role models, and that's what cultures have understood since the beginning of written history. I mean, it wasn't just Neanderthals. I mean, what do you think the troubadours were doing in the Middle Ages? They were telling the stories of heroes, Lancelot, etc., King Arthur, in that way inspiring other people to say, hey, I could do that too. Well, that's what Anne discovered. Anne Medlock, who started the Giraffe Heroes Project. She understood that if you wanted people to be heroic, you had to tell stories of people who were already being heroic. And so she set about finding these people. It wasn't hard. There are all kinds of people that are heroic. You just never hear about it. You never hear their stories. And so Anne determined to basically set up a whole broadcasting network based on telling the stories of heroes. And she did that for her living room on Central Park West in New York City. It was an amazing act of personal courage on Anne's part. But it caught on. It caught on, and we met, and I joined her, and within a year or two, we had a wonderful story in the New York Times about the Giraffe Heroes Project, and it was onward and upward from there. It's been 44 years now, and we've told the stories now of over 2,000 people, and all of them are doing brave things to make their world a better place. Obviously, they're men and women. I think the youngest might have been 11 years old. I think there was one that was 100 years old. They're every color in the rainbow. They're from all kinds of countries, and we tell their stories. And in that way, just like the Neanderthals around their campfire, we got inspired other people to stick their necks out too. 44 years, we've invented a schools program, and schools all over the English-speaking world and Spanish-speaking world now, teaching kids to develop lives of courage and compassion, helping them do that. I've written 3-4 books all on that same central theme of basically teaching courage. How do you be brave, and what are the role models for doing that? And I know you're going to ask me next, how do you do that? We can say, I'll shut up for now, but I mean, that's what we do. And we've done it for 44 years. And I think we've inspired hundreds of thousands of people to get off their butts and see what's going amiss around them. Could be a community issue. Maybe there's a polluted stream running through their community. Could be a company issue. Maybe your company's doing something unethical, and you need to put a stop to it. You become a whistleblower. Maybe it's a government officer who's in my point of view, there's lots of people that fit that description these days, government people that are ignoring our Constitution and our laws, and someone's got to put a stop to it. And so there are all kinds of ways to be a hero. And we tell the stories of people from all walks of life being heroes. It's a very simple strategy. I don't know. From the beginning of recorded history, this is how people have done it, and we're just following in their footsteps.
Well, it's very important to inspire courage in people. I wonder, has anyone ever taken it too far? In the beginning of your life, you were describing some of the violent adventures that you were going on, and some might describe that as reckless. So as you talk to people about being courageous, how do you ensure that they are also being considerate of the risk that they are taking on?
Well, I haven't mentioned this yet, but one of the things I've been doing now just for the last year, I'm getting great pleasure from doing it, is I started a series of short form videos now up on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. And the title of the series is Badass Granddad. Badass, all one word, and Granddad with 2 D's in the middle. And they're just 3-minute segments. The first 2 minutes is about one of my wild ass adventures. That gets people, especially young people, leaning forward saying, "Who the hell is this guy?" And then I pivot and I start talking about whatever led me to do that particular adventure. And then I offer some life lessons about courage, about perseverance, about trust. And I do it having told my war stories in a non-smarmy way that people really get. And I now have something like 110,000 followers, which people tell me is pretty damn good in a year. So I have I have that. And at the end of most of my broadcasts, I answer your question. What do you do? And can you go too far? Well, I tell my listeners, as badass granddad, I say, look, as far as I'm concerned, risk taking is an essential part of life. And if you try to live your life without taking any risk, you're going to live a life that's boring and ultimately inconsequential. And I use that word, and I'm criticized for it. Who the hell do I think I am? And I do it advisedly because I do think risk taking is important. But then I quickly follow it up by saying, look, if you're going to take risks, be sure you take smart risks and not stupid ones. What's a smart risk? A smart risk is one where you're informed and aware. You know what the hell is going on. You know what the opposition is. You've done some homework. You're not flying blind. That's important. Second thing is to make a plan if you have time. Sometimes you don't, but most of the time you have some sense of making a plan. How can I approach this risk? What's the best way to do it with best chances of success? Form a team. If you need help, find that help. That could be anything from forming a work team to joining a demonstration, but finding a team and getting the contacts you need. Fourth thing is to take stock of your own skills and resources. If you're really good with math, for example, then maybe the risks you take are risks that have to do with the scientific engineering stuff, like blockchains, for example. You got to have a certain sense of how to work with figures and technology to do what you're doing, Michael, in terms of working with blockchains and AI. Okay, but on the other hand, if you've been born a natural musician, maybe the risk you take would be developing a life as a musician and taking the risks you need to take to make that profession real for you. So anyway, you take stock of who you are and what you use the skills and resources you have. And the last thing I think maybe is the most important is you need to sit back and take a hard look at what the benefits of the risks are if you succeed. Weigh that benefit and then weigh the odds on you receiving that benefit. In other words, of your risk succeeding. Then the next thing is to look on the opposite side. What is the worst that can happen to you? Okay. And then what are the odds of that worst case scenario happening? So then when you have this data in your head, you can make a much more informed decision. Oh man, I think maybe I better not do that because I think maybe that falls into the area of stupid risk. And badass granddad is telling me to take smart risk. And okay, that's not a smart risk. So I've done that in my life, and I advise many other people, including all my followers, on badass granddad. That yes, you have to take risks. You absolutely have to. Otherwise, it's like a fine Swiss watch with no hands on it. You look at a mirror in the morning. What looks back at you? You want to know that you're on the planet for a reason or a purpose. I mean, why else would you be here unless to do something meaningful? I mean, like I was 60 years ago, stuck in Tacoma, Washington. What was I really just going to go to the same college my dad went to and then marry the girl next door and find a job with the neighbors from find a local job and then live out my life until someone puts me in a pine box? What's the purpose? I don't get it. So yeah, you take risks, but take smart risks and not stupid ones. And I outline 4 or 5 things that are kind of basic to me in terms of doing that.
That's very good advice. Take risks. And the consequence of not taking risks is that life is probably not fulfilling. You have to feel challenged a little bit. You have to push yourself. And John, what do you think about society as a whole when we lack people or a generation that doesn't have courage? What's the consequence of that?
Well, I don't think there's a generation that's ever lost courage. A lot of people have lost courage and lost hope. I'm just looking around the United States, for example, these days. A lot of people have lost courage to act, courage to fight back, and
Hmm.
lost hope. And it's hard. I'm not trying to say that my path is the only path, but I think what I did after that battle in Vietnam that finally turned my life around is good advice, and that is to take a look at what makes your life meaningful. Okay. In my case, I thought physical adventure made my life meaningful. And and I know today, we have plenty of friends that think their life is going to be meaningful as they amass money or power or both. And I'm saying that's not my experience, not for the long term. What makes life meaningful is some kind of giving back, of recognizing that you're on here on earth for a purpose, and that purpose is helping other people. I don't mean sackcloth and ashes. I don't mean becoming Mother Teresa. I mean just looking at a difficult problem and then getting off your butt and helping solve it. And you can do this as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, quite easily, making a fair product, selling it at a fair price under good labor conditions, good environmental conditions, operating a factory site, for example, with a good neighbor in your community. All of those things are a service, and you should count them as such. So you look at your life as a service. Again, not sackcloth and ashes. No, I'd get nowhere if I was preaching that. I'm just saying, no, look at what you're doing, look at what your resources are, and look at the problems that most concern you. Pick one of those problems and make a difference. Also, if you've never really thought this way before, then start small. Don't start agonizing tomorrow over what's going on in Gaza, for example, or whether Trump's going to invade Greenland. No, better to start much smaller. I mean, for example, maybe your local school board is trying to ban books and you don't like that. Well, okay. Instead of just complaining to your neighbors, go to a school board meeting, raise your hand and say, no, I don't agree with that, and tackle the school board or a county council or whatever. You can run for office if you want to, but you don't have to do that. You can simply support people that do and support responsible politicians who are willing to stick their necks out. But start someplace where you can grab hold of something real. And for most people, that's usually something local, and then build from there. And if you have the resources, which you do, which I do, then aim higher. I mean, you're looking at transforming the whole use of blockchains, for example. And as you said to me before we got started on this broadcast, um, you said that blockchains could actually aid in diplomacy and get people working together. I never thought of that. Well, you have, you know. You're young and you're smart and you're energetic. And here you've got this bit in your teeth that what's turning you on in terms of your profession, blockchains, artificial intelligence, can actually bring these people together. I kind of thought just the opposite. It was a bunch of really rich guys getting richer. And you're telling me, hey, wait a minute, that's a little simple-minded. Blockchains can really grease the skids on making things better, and you know how to do that, and you're teaching other people to do that. That's a hell of a service, Matthew, a hell of a service, and I credit you with that. So you look at what you can do with the skills and resources you've got. You do some planning. You're aware of what's happening. You assess the odds and make sure you don't trip off the edge of smart risk to stupid risk, the way we've been talking. And you use your resources. In your case, it seems to be to have a head that really does understand blockchains, where this old fart, John Graham, has almost no idea what the hell they are because I can't see them. But in any case, you do.
In addition to technology, I'm very involved in real estate and infrastructure, and I deliver a very similar message to you, which is that people need to find problems, but small problems, and start to tackle them. Maybe it's taking better care of neighborhoods or encouraging better planning at the local level, and then start to scale up. This is very relevant across the US now, where data centers are being developed, and it has consequences for the neighborhoods around that, where it's using fresh water, it's consuming energy. There's all sorts of pollution. A good way is to go to a board meeting, city board meeting, and say, we don't want this in our backyard. Or at the same time to say, we want to see more funding for affordable housing. There are ways for people to get involved. You don't have to redevelop our entire cities. And infrastructure is very meaningful to me because it's invisible. We appreciate it when it works, or actually we don't really appreciate it because it already works. You only recognize when the power is out or the water isn't running that something is wrong, but by then it's a little too late. So I think that's one of the things that we need to pay a little bit more attention to. I want to shift gears to civic activity. Go ahead.
I just want to add, and I'm glad you brought up real estate. I'm glad you brought up real estate because that's an ideal place to make a difference. I mean, here on my island in Washington State, I mean, I live near a village of 1,000 people, and some people are trying to build a block of low-income housing, just 12 houses, and there's all kinds of NIMBY pressures not to do that. Well, you got to show up at a planning board meeting, as you say, get active, talk to people, build trust, do what you have to do in a local level.
Right.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
No,
yeah.
it's a perfect example, and folks need to recognize that they do have that power. I think they're a little afraid to start, but you take a step, and very true to the idea of Giraffe Heroes, when you take a step, someone else is probably going to be inspired as well, because we're all looking for role models. So if you don't see any, that's probably an indicator that it's time for you to become the role model in whatever industry.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. And I think you're a great role model for doing what you're doing. I love what you just said about housing and community. You're absolutely right. And most people are just complaining about it, On the left, oh, it's those damn NIMBYs. And on the right, those people just, they're overeducated East Coast people who don't know what they're talking about. Whatever. I've seen that happen in my own county here in Whidbey Island, and the answer is even if it's slow and painstaking, to start building trust. Hell, I've waded into some fray where the opponents were so fierce there was no hope of addressing the issues initially. But, you meet these people in the grocery store or the car repair shop or something, and you have a few minutes. Well, hell, talk about something where you can establish some trust. In my case, that might be asking about their grandchildren, or complaining about the Mariners pitching, or the fact that the Mariners didn't get to the World Series, or whatever. Something I know we agree on, and start from there. I mean,
Hmm.
you build trust where you can, often at a local level, and then expand from there. Because the same thing that builds trust between you and your neighbor, where you don't agree, for example, on a low-income housing project, the same thing that builds trust there, which is patience, starting small, and really listening. The same thing that builds trust there is what builds trust wider, and the same thing that will help us mend this country together. We're now so polarized as a country; it's so hard to even talk to each other. Well, we got to start someplace, and I'm just saying, start where you can reach. As my wife Ann says, you pull up the corner of the rug you can pull up. You start there.
Makes sense. Well, let's shift gears to civics and diplomacy. You seem to have a lot of experience here. So what was your story shifting gears out of the violent adventures and starting to get involved with a more civic sense? What were your lessons from that over the years? And some good stories, because it
Well, as
sounds
I
like you've
said,
engaged a lot of different countries.
oh, I have. As I think I've mentioned a couple of times without any explanation, that the turnaround for me happened in a battle in Vietnam. I was over in Vietnam because I asked the State Department. I went over there as a volunteer. I mean, I never wore the uniform. I went over there in a civilian job, which is sometimes doing some pretty nasty stuff. I told the State Department to send me to the most dangerous place they had, and they did. I was the advisor to the mayor to the city of Hue, a small city right next to the DMZ that separated North Vietnam from South. Very dangerous place to be. It was great. I mean, I loved it. I loved the adventure of it, even though I could have been assassinated or blown up any single day the year and a half I was there. Uh, but then I slowly began to realize, when the North Vietnamese attacked in 1972, most people forget that, well, Vietnam fell, for us anyway, in 1975. It almost fell in 1972, the so-called Easter Offensive, when the North Vietnamese rushed across the DMZ and tried to take the country from the north. And they all but surrounded Hue, where I was. And at that point, because of the negotiations in Paris, we'd withdrawn all the American troops in my area. So it was just me and three other civilians. And the South Vietnamese army had broken, and most of them had run away. And the South Vietnamese leadership had collapsed. So part of my job was to establish martial law in Hue, so that we could get ammunition and supplies to the few South Vietnamese forces still fighting to defend the city. And it was incredible. It was like a scene from Kafka. I mean, there was artillery booming and broken glass, and looters had burned the marketplace. So there was a pall of heavy, greasy smoke, people screaming, glass shattering. Oh, it was incredible. And I realized right away that the problem in creating martial law was the deserters from the South Vietnamese army, who were doing all the looting and pillaging and raping, and they had to be stopped. So I screamed at the deputy mayor to set up a firing squad, start shooting the bastards. And yet I knew perfectly well that those deserters were mostly farm kids, 17, 18 years old, dragooned off their paddies maybe the month before, drunk out of their heads. And here I was starting to shoot them. And then my home was 6,000, 7,000 miles away. I knew the war from the moment I got there. I knew the war was lost. I thought the war was stupid. I thought the war was wrong and immoral. I was only there as a freebooter, as a mercenary, because it was a hell of an adventure. And that's the only reason I was there. And now people were dying because of my thirst for adrenaline. And it suddenly hit me in the middle of all this chaos, what was happening or not happening with my life. And I remember, I think I even put my head down and wept. I mean, like, Jesus Christ, what the hell is happening? Turned out the next morning, the skies cleared and American fighter jets off carriers off the coast, bombed the advancing North Vietnamese army, and my life was spared once again. Came back to California, got into what were then called encounter groups, which is in the day when you were get together with 12, 15, 18 other people and you spilled your guts in the hope of learning something honest about yourself, and it worked for me. I mean, I gradually, with the help of 12, 15 other people who kept shouting at me that I wasn't John Wayne, or if I was John Wayne, I was a lot more than John Wayne, that I had a heart, that I really did care. It was obvious that I cared, but it was like I nailed a big, heavy piece of plywood over my heart for 30 years, 20 years. And now I was paying the price, and I had to rip that plywood off my heart so I could be a complete human being. And that's when it started, ripping that plywood off my heart and understanding that these men in this encounter group were absolutely right. I did have a heart. I did have compassion. I did care about other people. I could build community, and I turned my life around. It took years, 3 steps forward, 2 back. But I gradually turned my life around, and the State Department sent me to the United Nations, where I was in charge of a lot of American policies in Africa and Asia, where there are plenty of peace and justice issues. Only now I was on the other side of those issues, trying to make the world better for all the billions of people who were suffering from violence and disease and bad leadership and stuff. And I was pretty much alone, because my own government, even under a nice guy like Jimmy Carter, president at the time, my own government didn't do much about it because there was too much money to be made. Everything was too transactional. And not only that, we were in the middle of the Cold War. So the only thing diplomatically that mattered to the United States was whether or not some small country in Africa would vote on our side on some issue with the United Nations. And we didn't give a damn. There were people starving or sick from preventable disease. We just wanted their votes in the United Nations. And they knew that. The 100 or so countries in the so-called third world knew that, and they hated us for that. So it was really hard for me to start building trust and to begin to understand that that's where my future lay. And so I started doing that. I took talk about risk-taking. I mean, I started talking to diplomats from Africa and Asia in the Security Council and even giving them classified documents, for example, showing where American gun runners were making life worse for a lot of people in the third world, especially in South Africa, which was then run by whites under a system of racial oppression called apartheid. And I had gone to South Africa and seen for myself. I declared that I was going to change things, and I was going to do that by getting the UN to stop the flow of guns to the South African military and police. But it was hard to do because there were a lot of American business people who were actively supplying these guns because of all the money to be made. Same thing in Europe. So we were talking a good thing. Carter was saying all the right things about human rights, but at the same time, American policies were going in the opposite direction. And I determined to stop that, and I did. It's a long story. I won't go into it. But I took enormous risks, double-crossing my own government repeatedly and working with African diplomats behind the scenes, way behind the scenes. I could have been fired or put in jail for some of the stuff I did at that time. But I worked for peace and justice issues, and I'm proud to say that I played a heavy role in the end of apartheid in South Africa, a heavy role, a good role, and I'm really proud of that. But I did it by taking risks, taking good risks, and doing so for the right reasons. But I came out, I did that only by crawling out of a hole where the risks I took were all physical. And now the risks we take were not so much physical, but having the moral courage to stand up and do what I had to do to influence the United Nations to impose an arms embargo on South Africa, as an example. There are other examples, but that's the best one. And at that point, I quit the Foreign Service because I was going to be fired anyway. I was way too independent for them. At that point, also, I had met Ann Medlock, the person who had started the Giraffe Heroes Project, and I think the rest of the story starts from there. The Giraffe Project has been my life for the last 44 years.
Wow, 44 years. So what do you do with the Giraffe Project? I mean, we've covered what the mission is, but how do you actually provide the service? Do you do public speaking? Is there a course or a book? Like, how do people interact with Giraffe Heroes?
All of that. All of that. The most basic way is to simply read the stories of the people that we find and honor, like 2,000 of them now. And they're all reachable on a free database on our website, which is giraffe.org, um, and get inspired. And that's the main thing that we do is we are storytellers. The same, we're the troubadours of our time, Matthew. That's what we do. Same time, we operate a schools program for kids, helping them build lives of courage and compassion. I've written books all about not only about the need for being brave and taking risks, and the necessity for taking risks and how to take risks, but practical things too about civic engagement. Questions you need to know. I mean, how to form a team, how to deal with conflict, whatever, the practical things in terms of risk taking to make a diplomatic or a social or political difference. We do all of this. And so now, of course, I don't run around the world, which I used to do, giving speeches because COVID shut that down 5 years ago. And now at 83, I don't want to do that anymore. I hate getting on airplanes, and I don't have to because Ann Medlock and I, my partner, are getting pretty darn adept at social media. So we do it all on social media. We do it all on a variety of social media platforms. We write books. I have a blog, a political blog, in which, by the way, my current project is writing a long piece on artificial intelligence. And we do everything we can, but all oriented toward getting more and more people to stick their necks out to solve problems, and then giving them whatever tools we have to help them succeed in doing that. I don't know if that answers your question, but the answer is
It
that
does.
the strategy hasn't changed 44 years. The strategy is the same, moving people to stick their necks out. The tactics change all the time. Now we're on
Right.
social media. When Ann started 44 years ago, she was telling stories with fax machines and vinyl records sent to radio stations. Now it's much different. Tactics change,
Wow.
but the strategy hasn't changed.
That's incredible just to imagine. And it's very cool that you got to see all of the technology change over the years. And yet the principles stay the same, which I think demonstrates the value of them when something is so persistent. And I guess that's because people are always going to have this battle with courage. There's always that conflict of, some call it good versus evil, or democracy versus tyranny. It's always going to exist. So people are always going to need to bear some responsibility that they're uncomfortable with. It'll never go away. Never ever. So you'll never be out of a job. That's for sure. Lots of stories on Giraffe. So I will have links to your site, Giraffe, and your social medias that you mentioned in the show notes where people can check that out,
Mhm.
read about the stories, and hear about your own stories.
Thank
I
you.
know that you have lots and lots of videos full of wisdom, little snippets, which are probably easier to scroll through than a 45-minute podcast. But it's really great that we've been able to have a long form conversation. We need more of that. We need more courage. We need more people thinking about what makes the world go round. What keeps society afloat. We don't have these conversations very often anymore. Like you said, things are so polarized. People don't like having difficult conversations. We're shying away from it. But the chickens come home to roost at some point, and then there's a consequence. So whatever we can do to inspire folks, and I think this episode is definitely going to be one that roll up the sleeves. Let's get to work, after hearing John's story. So John, any final thoughts as we wrap up here?
I just want to thank you. I mean, it's great. I'm really inspired to see someone who clearly you're half my age, and you seem to share a very similar vision. And not only that, but you're smart and you're adept in modern technologies that I will never master. And so you're kind of like the next leg of this, using blockchain and AI technology to help further the same kind of mission, same kind of vision that's driven the Giraffe Project for 44 years. You're doing it now with technologies that the Giraffe Project really hasn't touched. So I'm so glad that you've got me on your podcast because I think people like you are the next leg, you know? You share the vision and you're smart enough to use modern technologies to try to move it the next step.
Well, I appreciate that. And if you ever want to collaborate on any items, I make myself readily available for the cause.
Thank you.
Well, John, it's been a pleasure. I hope everyone else enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully we can reconnect in the future. Wishing you all the best in whatever comes next in your wild ass life.
Yeah, yeah, badass granddad. I do urge your listeners. It's only 3 minutes. Just go to one of those three platforms: TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, and dial in "badass granddad" in the search box. You'll really enjoy it. They're fun to do. Anyway, thank you again.
All the best.